In the spring of 1960, after years spent in obscurity, a man living under the name Ricardo Clement was located and captured in a quiet neighborhood of Buenos Aires. He was brought to Israel in a secret operation that would echo through history. The man was Adolf Eichmann, SS Obersturmbannführer, a former high-ranking official of the Sicherheitsdienst and a key logistical officer during the years of the Third Reich. On May 29, 1960, at 4:45 p.m., Eichmann was escorted into an interrogation room in Jerusalem, where the first official dialogue began. He appeared modest in khaki clothes and sandals, wearing no signs of his former status. Yet behind him stood years of records, orders, and memoranda. With composure and clarity, he would now respond to the questions of the investigators. Thus began a series of interrogations that would shed light on one of the most complex administrative systems of wartime Europe.
You recognize me, I presume? I am Colonel Hofstetter of the Israeli police.
Jawohl!
Herr Eichmann, I am told that you are willing, eager in fact, to give us your version of your role in the so-called Third Reich. Is that right?
Yes, that is right.
You are fully aware that you are not being coerced in any way.
Jawohl!
Then Captain Less will stay here with you and start taking your statement. I realize that you will need certain documents. In the course of your statement, Captain Less will draw up a list of the documents you need, and as far as possible we shall procure these documents. That is all, I believe.
I believe we should begin with your curriculum vitae.
I was born on March 19th, 1906, at Solingen in the Rhineland. My father was a bookkeeper at the Solingen Light and Power Company. That was the name, more or less. In 1913, my father was transferred to the Linz Light and Power Company in Linz on the Danube, probably in connection with a loan which the AEG, Allgemeine Elektrizitätsgesellschaft, or General Electric, gave that Austrian company, in which he served as commercial director until 1924. In 1914, my father moved his family to Austria. So, from 1914 on, I lived in Linz on the Danube in Upper Austria with my parents and my brothers and sisters.
Suppose we go back a little. What was your father's name?
My father's name was Adolf Karl Eichmann. My mother's name was Maria Eichmann, née Schefferling.
What other children were there?
My father married twice. My first mother died in 1916. She bore him 5 children. The next after me was Emil, 2 years younger than me.
He was born in 1908?
I believe so, Herr Hauptmann, because the next one, Helmuth, was 3 years younger than me. He was killed in Stalingrad during the war. The next was a sister, Irmgard. She is 4 or 5 years younger than me, I believe.
Do you remember the exact date of your sister's birth?
I haven't seen any of my brothers and sisters for 18 years. The next brother from that marriage was Otto, our youngest. The quick succession of births was responsible for the early death of my first mother. In 1916, my father remarried. His second wife was a very strict religious Protestant.
Are you affiliated with any religious denomination?
I belonged to the Evangelical Church until 1937. Then I left. After that, in the course of the 15 years since 1945, during which I acquired new insights after those times, I have gone back to it inwardly, but I did not join officially because I felt uncomfortable. Mainly because of my father, who was a very religious man. For a good many years, he was an honorary elder of the evangelical congregation in Linz. He died on February 5th of this year.
You also belonged to the Young Men's Christian Association for a time?
I joined when I was very young. The whole family was taken to church at 9 o'clock Sunday morning, and either after church or on Sunday afternoon, we went to the YMCA. It was only when they put in a new young people's training director, with whom we did not see eye to eye, that I went over to the Wandervogel, Scouts, to be exact, the Griffin group, which belonged to the Federated Youth Organizations. I was still a member at the age of 18 when I was at vocational school.
What school did you attend in Linz?
In Linz, I attended elementary school up to the 4th grade, and then Realschule, scientific secondary school, also up to the 4th year.
What Realschule?
The Kaiser Franz Staatsoberrealschule. Later, it was renamed Bundesoberrealschule, because that was the time of the Anschluss.
How long did you attend this secondary school? 4 years? What year did you leave?
I must have finished elementary school in 1916 to 1917. During the revolution, I was at secondary school. I can still remember that there was rioting during classes.
What street did you live on in Linz?
Bischofstraße.
Was that an apartment house?
It was, right in the middle of town.
When you finished school in 1921 at the age of 15, did you enlist for 1 year?
No, 1 year enlistment had been discontinued. I went on to vocational school, Höhere Bundeslehranstalt for Elektrotechnik, Maschinenbau und Hochbau, School for Electrical, Mechanical and Structural Engineering, still in Linz. I was there for 4 terms.
Were you employed at that time?
Yes, my father took an early retirement about then and went into business for himself. First in Salzburg, where he founded the Untersberg Mining Company, in which he held 51% of the stock. The mines were between Salzburg and the German border, but the company never really got off the ground. Next, he acquired an interest in a mill construction enterprise in the Innviertel region of Upper Austria. My father often regretted this later, because it was just at the time of the economic crisis that he went into business in Austria. He not only failed to make money, but his savings and my second mother's too were put into the businesses and evaporated. I forgot to mention that my father also had an interest in a machine shop in Salzburg, where they made locomobiles. The original owner hanged himself after spending the money that his partner, that is, my father, had put into the business. Then one day, my father shut down the Untersberg Mining Company, but for years after that, he went on paying so-called prospection fees to the mining authority.
In which of your father's firms did you work?
Well, you see, my father took me out of school, because I may as well admit it, I hadn't been exactly the most conscientious of students. He put me into the Untersberg Mining Company. I had to work both below and above ground. It was a small mine. The main tunnels were no more than 300 meters long. There were a few side tunnels and some small shafts. The purpose was to extract oil from oil shale oil for medicinal purposes, residues, asphalt, etc., etc. A foreman kept after me, and I had to work my shifts just like the rest of them.
How many workers were there?
10 in all, I believe.
How long did you work there?
It must have been about 3 months. It couldn't have been any longer. Then I was sent to Austrian Elektrotech, Elektrobau, as a volunteer, as they called it at the time. I had been to secondary school, and I had my 1-year voluntary enlistment, as they used to say. Of course, it wasn't valid. All parents in those days liked their children to get at least their 1-year voluntary enlistment behind them. Then, instead of calling it apprenticeship, they called it the volunteer period, and I stayed with Austrian Elektrotech for 2.5 years.
All this in Linz?
Yes, Austrian Elektrotech and the Austrian Water Power Company were subsidiaries of the Light and Power Company. Elektrotech manufactured and sold electrical appliances. The Linz Light and Power Company was the sole producer of electrical current. The current was produced by Austrian Water Power in their plant in the Mühlviertel region.
In what department were you apprenticed? Did you go through all the departments?
No, I was sent to Elektrotech. My father wanted me to become a salesman. Radio was just coming in. I concentrated on this new item because of the novelty. After 2.5 years, my father said I wasn't getting anywhere and decided I should become a traveling agent, as they called it then, meaning a traveling salesman for the vacuum oil company in Upper Austria. It seems my parents had just seen an ad in the daily paper. My mother, who usually took the initiative in such matters, had got in touch with a cousin of hers who was president of the Austrian Automobile Club. He lived in Vienna and was a close friend of the head of the vacuum oil company for Austria, a Herr Weiss.
Did you meet this Herr Weiss personally and speak to him?
No, I had to report to the provincial director in Linz, who told me there were plenty of openings, but that he'd have to send me to Vienna to introduce myself.
How old were you at the time?
I was very young, I beg your pardon. I'll have to think a minute.
That's quite all right, Herr Eichmann. Would you care for a cigarette?
If you don't mind. In 1928, I was 22. I went to Vienna, reported to the main office of vacuum oil, and was taken to a Herr Popper, who told me I was too young, but I had been hired at the request of Herr Weiss, the president. Evidently, the man had received instructions from his top boss. I reported back to the Linz office and spent the next few days learning about Sphinx gasoline, kerosene, and the various grades of gargoyle mobile oil. Then I was let loose in the city of Linz, and after a week or two of preparatory work, I was assigned a district of Upper Austria as my exclusive territory.
Was it a large district?
Oh yes, it was half of Upper Austria.
Were you living with your parents at the time? With your father and stepmother?
Yes, I lived with them. But I only came home on Saturdays and Sundays, or once in a while in midweek when my route was changed. That year, most of my work consisted of setting up gas stations in my territory. At the same time, I arranged for the kerosene deliveries in most of the Mühlviertel, because electrification hadn't gone very far in that district. I was especially interested in supplying kerosene, because it took me into territory where modern life and high speed hadn't yet penetrated. The Mühlviertel is a dreamy little district. The people were still living as they had been 50 or even 100 years before. That appealed to me. And then there was the natural beauty of the place. Mixed forests, partly deciduous, partly evergreen, and then the romantic feel of the place. It's amazingly rich in old castles, or it might be more accurate to speak of the ruins of many generations of nobility. Some are very old, real ruins, you could say. On all my trips, I visited those ruins. I stayed there until 1933, and then I was transferred from Upper Austria to Salzburg. That transfer went against my grain. They gave me no advance notice. The greater part of the Salzburg district was assigned to me. At first I was happy, because it was winter, and the high mountains were all covered with snow. Then came the spring season. The tourists crowded into Kitzbühel, Hofgastein, Dorfgastein, Bad Gastein, and all that bustle repelled me. I didn't enjoy my work anymore. I lost interest in selling, in calling on customers. I went on doing my daily work, but after the Whitsun holidays of 1933, Director Blum said to me, "We've got to cut down on personnel." He said I was the only unmarried salesman, and that's why he had hit on me. So they gave me notice.
That was in 1933? After the Whitsun holidays?
Personally, I was glad to be dismissed, but my parents weren't happy about it. I was given 5 months' pay, one for each year I had been with the firm.
And what did you do after returning to Linz?
I stayed with my parents and tried to figure out what to do next. My father's industrial ventures had all failed. He had lost everything and was looking for work as district sales manager for Upper and Lower Austria. He still had the connections built up in 24 years with electrical concerns. His first sales managership was with Philips radio tubes, then with Varta storage batteries. He started again at the bottom and had already built up a good business. But I had no desire to sell radio tubes and storage batteries. I thought of starting a business of my own, selling lubricants, as agent for some unknown brand, not for any cartel member. I knew plenty of prospective customers, especially in Upper Austria. While I was making preparations, I ran into some sort of difficulties. I don't remember what, maybe something financial, or maybe something was wrong with the proposition. Anyway, I remember that I was on my way to Efferding to see my first customer, and I suddenly decided to turn back. I said to myself, after all, I'm a German citizen. Why not go to Germany and try my luck with vacuum oil?
What prompted that decision?
I was a relatively young man and used to being led in business and in everything else. Maybe I just lost my nerve, I really don't remember. I probably had other difficulties of some kind. Anyway, I broke off my trip and told my parents I was going to Germany. Germany was a big country, I said, and there was sure to be work there, probably even in the oil business. Because at that time, there was a lot of unemployment in Austria.
All that was in 1933?
Yes, sir. To make this part of my story perfectly clear, I have to switch from business matters to the so-called political sphere. It should be pointed out that the employment situation in Austria was scarcely worse than in Germany at the time. True, Hitler kept trumpeting his promise that the 6 million German unemployed would be back at work within 4 years, but in view of the world crisis, that was hardly credible. Quite aside from economic considerations, I had other reasons for wanting to get away. To leave Austria and go to Germany. Even in my school days, we had political groups, all perfectly harmless, of course. Nationalists, socialists, monarchists. The kind of thing youngsters go in for, revolutionary and so on, without thinking about it very much. For instance, you'd join the monarchists or the nationalists, just because you had a good friend in one of these groups. That was the first political talk I had heard. At home, the subject was never mentioned. My father wasn't interested in politics. I had an old friend in Linz. His name was Friedrich von Schmidt. His father was Field Marshal Lieutenant von Schmidt, whom I never met because he died before I made friends with his son. The family was enormously proud of the father, because he'd risen from private to Field Marshal Lieutenant in the days of the Emperor Franz Joseph. So he must have been very brave, a fine, upstanding soldier, and a fine, upstanding man. Anyway, it was a distinguished family. My friend's mother had been a Countess so-and-so. Their world had collapsed in 1919, but they were still living with the old ideas. They kept up the old forms as if nothing had happened. But sometimes, my friend Friedrich von Schmidt would forget his fine manners, and then he was just a good fellow. He had connections with First World War veterans organizations, since he associated mostly with military men. One day, he persuaded me to join the Young Veterans Association. That was the youth section of the German Austrian Veterans Association. Its slogan was, "Public need before public greed." Except for the Social Democratic Schutzbund Defense League, it was the only organization that dared to march through the streets, and not very often at that. It evidently had the support of the government. Most of the members held monarchist opinions. Some were Christian-oriented, and only a vanishing minority were nationalists. National Socialism was still unheard of.
So most of you were loyal to Austria?
We young men sometimes took the streetcar to Kleinmünchen, a suburb of Linz. A marksman's organization had a rifle range there. A rifle was put into my hands for the first time, and I was taught marksmanship. That I remember well. Those early days in the Veterans Association must have been in 1928 to 1929. Around 1931, there was friction between nationalists and monarchists. By that time, the SA, Nazi stormtroopers, were also marching through the streets. The SS tried to recruit members of the Veterans Association in Linz because we were tolerated by the government and allowed to practice marksmanship, and at that time, the SS had no objection. One day, the NSDAP, National Socialist German Workers' Party, as they called themselves, staged a mass meeting in the Marsenkeller, a big Bavarian-style beer hall. Gauleiter Bolek made a speech, and then a certain Ernst Kaltenbrunner came up to me. We'd seen each other around. His father was a lawyer in Linz, and his father and my father had had business connections for 20 years. Ernst Kaltenbrunner put it to me straight from the shoulder. "You're going to join us." That's how it was done in those days, all very free and easy, no fuss. I said, "All right." So I joined the SS.
That was in...
It was either late 1931 or early 1932. It must show up in my papers. I don't remember exactly. In Salzburg, I attended to my regular work at Vacuum Oil. I returned to Linz every Friday. That's where I did my SS duty, because during the week I was never available. Every Friday, I was on duty at the so-called Brown House in Linz, which the party had bought. I slept on a straw pallet and did night guard duty. Since I was one of the few who was working and making good money, they were always glad to see me, because next door to this Brown House there was a restaurant, and I regularly treated the boys to beer or cider and cigarettes. On Saturday mornings, I went home, washed, and finished up my work for Vacuum Oil. That is, I wrote reports and cleared up certain questions. That was when the uniform with the beret came in. I had one of those uniforms made. One day we went to Freilassing. An SS auxiliary police unit was stationed in Freilassing. The members of SS Standard 37 from Salzburg and Linz, an SS regiment, went there every Sunday to be whipped into shape. In the evening we'd be driven back to Salzburg, and the next morning I went back to my work. I happened to be in Pinzgau when I heard that the party had been suppressed in Austria.
What year was that?
That was in 1933, just before Whitsun. My uniform was at the tailor's, bought and paid for, but I never called for it, because the party was suppressed. Besides, as I've told you, I had been fired from my job. On the way to Efferding to close my first personal business deal, I said to myself, "There's no point in this. I'm going to Germany." So one fine morning, I set out from Linz with my parents' blessing, a German passport, and a letter from the German consul stating that I came from one of the most respected families of the Linz German colony and requesting the assistance of the German authorities, the usual sort of recommendation.
Before leaving, you had to give your SS standard notice, didn't you?
Yes, that came next. I went to see Dr. Kaltenbrunner, you know, my friend Ernst, who then held the rank of Truppführer, which later became Oberscharführer. But his duties were much more important than the rank indicates. You see, he was also a lawyer, and he had gone into his father's firm. He said, "Come back tomorrow. I'll give you some letters. You'll put them in your suitcase, hide them, take them across with you and report to Gauleiter Bolek in Passau." That was the Gauleiter in exile. I picked up the letters.
From Kaltenbrunner Jr.?
Yes, Junior. His old man was dead by then. At the border, I didn't have to open anything. The headquarters of the Upper Austria Gauleiter were right there on Bahnhofstrasse. I sent the letters in, and then I had a long wait in the waiting room. Finally, I was taken to Gauleiter Bolek. I told him why I'd come and asked him if he knew how I could get into Vacuum Oil, the Bavarian branch of the Vacuum Oil Company. He said it would be better if I played soldier for a while. It was high time I learned how to walk. I said to myself, "All right, I'll be a soldier." I had no one to provide for. So then they sent me to Kloster-Lechfeld.
Was that a school or an army post?
It was a big training station from First World War days, set up by the old army. There were barracks, lots of them, and nearby there was a monastery, Kloster, and a brewery. Those barracks weren't new, and there had also been a big canteen there. Bavarian state police were in charge of our training. We were all known as the Austrian Legion.
Lechfeld was both an SA and an SS camp?
Right. There was a complete Sturmband battalion of SS, 3 Stürmer companies, but probably more than 500 men, and probably quite a lot more SA men. Training was given. To all intents and purposes, there were only 2 branches of service, infantry and engineers. The engineers were given shock troop training. The doctor did all the selecting. The huskiest went to the shock troop, the rest to the infantry. I went to the shock troop because I was stronger than I am now. We were trained mostly in street fighting. Since my handwriting was fairly decent, they made me a top kick right away. You know, company first sergeant, and I had to keep the marksmanship records. In addition to our military training, we marched for hours every day on the drill ground in preparation for the party congress. Later, it must have been in October 1933, I received orders to report to a Sturmbannführer Pickel in Passau. He was head of the Reichsführer SS's liaison team in Passau. The work of his liaison staff, consisting of 8, maybe 10 men, was to patrol the border between Austria and Bavaria regularly, in collaboration with the border police. Because at that time fugitives were crossing over from Austria to Germany both by day and by night, and they had to be taken care of. The ones who were members of the SA or SS were sent to the Austrian Legion. At the same time, propaganda material was being smuggled from Bavaria to Austria. The duty was monotonous, but I enjoyed it because it took me through the Bavarian forest, which is pretty much like the forests in the Mühlviertel, my second home. I don't remember my first home at all. In my heart, I suppose it's Austria. I felt very happy there. We ate in a butcher shop where they also sold hot sausages and potato salad. Sturmbannführer Pickel made me his assistant. I was allowed to handle minor matters on my own responsibility. He gave me a small sum of money, 50 marks at a time I think it was, with which I bought lunch for all the men involved, and soap and things like that, and we'd settle up afterwards. I was also used for writing letters and reports to SS headquarters in Munich. It was a dead, lazy sort of existence, and I was pretty sure Herr von Pickel had private interests in Passau. He was a man who liked to live well, he had fine manners, and it seemed to me that some of the ladies in Passau took up a lot of his time. Strictly speaking, the work of the liaison staff was worthless. This evidently dawned on the higher-ups after a while, because after Christmas 1934, the staff was dissolved, and we were all sent to Dachau. By that time, I had 1 star on my collar patch. In other words, I was an Unterscharführer, or sergeant.
And what happened in Dachau?
There they went in for strict military discipline. Up until then, I hadn't seen anything like it. We were a battalion of the Deutschland Regiment, which consisted entirely of Austrians. Our quarters were outside the concentration camp, in an enormous iron and concrete hangar formerly used for storing munitions. We slept in triple-decker bunks. The concentration camp was guarded by Bavarian SS men. They wore the death's head on their collar patches. We Austrians called them death's headers. Our collar patch had the runic SS symbol with the figure 1.
Who were your commanding officers there?
Our commanding officer was a Prussian police major, converted into an SS officer. The company commanders were Hauptsturmführers, previously Prussian police captains. On parade, the commanders would lead their units on horseback. We were all foot troops. They gave us regular military training, the same as in the Reichswehr. None of the shock troop nonsense we'd had in Lechfeld. Strict military discipline was the rule. I stayed there until September 1934. A short time before, I had heard that the Reichsführer's SD, Sicherheitsdienst, or security service, was recruiting men with army experience. The men couldn't talk of anything else, because a lot of them were dissatisfied with the hard military life. I didn't mind that. What bothered me was the monotony. Let me tell you a story to show how little I minded the tough training. I used to tell it later on to the officers and non-coms under me. This was still in Lechfeld. A common punishment, later it was forbidden, was to make us crawl through rushes and over gravel. The first time it happened, some of the men went on sick call and got themselves declared unfit for duty. Because I thought we were being treated unfairly, I gritted my teeth and stuck it out. The skin had been scraped off my elbows, but I didn't have them bandaged. After lunch, we had to start in again. The bits of plaster I'd stuck on my wounds were scraped off in a minute. I had no skin left on my elbows at all, but I stuck it out. That way, I attracted attention and got myself promoted. So it wasn't the hard life in Dachau that made me think, how am I going to get out of here? It was the crushing monotony. When I heard that the Reichsführer's SD was taking men, I said to myself, this looks good to me.
The Reichsführer SS was Heinrich Himmler?
Right. I thought, there I'll be where the action is. I'll have to keep my eyes open. I'll see all sorts of things. I'll be here and there and everywhere. I applied for a pass to Munich. Motive: to apply to the SD for admission. They made me fill out a questionnaire. Then I was sent back to Dachau. For a long time I didn't hear anything and I thought my application had been passed over.
How did you feel about the point denying Jews the right to be German citizens?
When I joined the NSDAP, I didn't give these details, a thought. And these details were never discussed among so-called comrades.
Have you read Rosenberg's Myth of the 20th Century?
No, I have not read it. To tell the truth, I never read any books about National Socialism either before or after. Before going into the SD, I didn't read at all, much to the dismay of my father, who often pointed out to me that he had an excellent library in the house, with all the classics, which he had built up in the course of his life, evidently to no purpose. When I was with the SD, it wasn't those books that I read, but others, as I've already told you in part. I read specifically Jewish books. I read books about Freemasonry. I doubt if I read any other book in all that time, novels, for instance. I've never in all my life read crime thrillers or love stories. I still don't.
Those books you read about the Jews, were they critical?
I only read books written by Jews. No others were of any use to me in my study. My mind was not clouded by any previous knowledge.
Did you know that Hitler accused the Jews of causing the defeat of Germany in the First World War?
At that time, I belonged to the category of people who form no opinions of their own.
Did you read the Protocols of the Elders of Zion?
No, I did not. But I heard about it, and I couldn't imagine what it could be. When I asked Mildenstein, and he described it as rubbish, I accepted that opinion, and I disposed of it in more or less the same words. I remember that clearly, at the SD school in Bernau.
When did you leave the evangelical church?
It must have been in 1937. In those years, in 1935 I think, it had become fashionable for SD members to resign from the party. From the church, I mean, of course. But when it came to religion, I refused to be pressured, partly because I had always been deeply rooted in the church. For one thing, because my father had been an elder of the evangelical congregation in Linz for years, and I didn't want to do that to my old father. Besides, I said to myself, especially in the years when I was reading scientific works on religion at the SD, I said to myself, this is a decision that calls for careful thought. And in 1935, I was married in church, though they tried to dissuade me. I wasn't forbidden, they just made fun of me. My wife herself wouldn't have married any other way, because she comes of a religious, that's right, a solidly Catholic peasant family.
Then why did you leave?
More and more, I came to the conclusion that God can't possibly be as small as in the Bible stories. I thought I'd found my own belief. And I read Schopenhauer, who says the way of religious faith is safer, and the way of freedom is a dangerous way, which the individual must perpetually work out for himself. I said to myself, the God I believe in is greater than the Christian God, because I believe in a great and powerful God who created the universe and keeps it in motion. No one influenced me. My wife tried to hold me back, but then I stopped telling her anything about my work. And one fine day I went to the courthouse and had my records changed.
Did you join the German church?
No, I left the church of my own free will, not because it was the thing to do or because anyone made me. And I did not join any other church.
In your official records, your religion is down as theist. Doesn't that apply to the German church?
Everyone who left the church at that time called himself a theist, because he had to call himself something.
Were you a loyal, unconditionally obedient SS man?
Yes, I can say I was. I had taken the oath, and I obeyed orders. In the first years, I had no conflicts, no inner conflicts of any kind. I sat at my desk and did my work. My unconditional, my absolute allegiance underwent a change when the so-called solution of the Jewish question became more violent. That is, when the gassing and shooting started. I made no secret of the fact, and I said, yes, I believe I said, to my superior, Gruppenführer Müller. I said, this isn't what I imagined. It probably isn't what any of us imagined, because it's not a political solution. We were still talking about a political solution. Up until then, that was the approved line. But this wasn't a political solution, and then
In what terms did you state this opinion?
I said the exact same words I've just said. The same sentence, when I came back from Minsk and saw what was going on, and from Chelman, those places. That's what I said.
Did you unconditionally support the National Socialist philosophy?
Yes and no. In those years, the first years, I didn't give the National Socialist philosophy and such things a thought. In those first years, what mattered to me, as I've already said, was work and bread for 7 million people, an Autobahn, and the fight against Versailles. In those matters, my attitude was unconditional. And later on, in my military service, to all intents and purposes, it was military service. And at first I liked it, until the time came when I wanted to get out and go into private industry, but found myself behind a desk instead. And in this desk work, Herr Hauptmann, in the first place you weren't asked, and in the second place, you didn't waste your time thinking about unconditional allegiances, unconditional loyalty, because you threw yourself head over heels into your work.
In other words, you were a convinced National Socialist, a loyal SS man true to the oath you had taken. How then do you explain your contention that you have never hated the Jews and were never an anti-Semite?
That is true, Herr Hauptmann. I would certainly have had conflicts sooner, In Dachau, if, for instance, instead of being in SS Battalion 1 in the Austrian SS, that is, I'd been behind the barbed wire, serving as a concentration camp guard. But since for many years I had no contact with such things, I didn't worry my head about them, because I didn't have to do them.
But you must have had anti-Jewish opinions, because they were required. A large part of the program had to do with the Jews.
But not in the early period, Herr Hauptmann. In the early period, the Jewish problem wasn't the main thing. What interested us in Austria was work and bread, freedom, an end to servitude.
But wasn't hatred of the Jews a leitmotif running all through Hitler's Mein Kampf?
That is possible. I've told you I never read it carefully. I never read it through. I didn't need to. Yes, Herr Hauptmann, of course there was hatred of the Jews in it. But in those days, there were lots of party members with Jewish relatives by blood or marriage. I myself knew an SS Scharführer who was a Jew.
What was his name?
I don't know, but he came to see me one day in Berlin and asked me what he should do. He had been an Oberscharführer during the fighting days. I said to him, "Good God, man, there's nothing I can do for you. The only advice I can give you is clear out, go to Switzerland or somewhere else, because it's no good for you here. It's no good, it's hopeless." Then he asked me to give the border station between Austria and Switzerland instructions so he could be sure of crossing safely without papers. So I instructed them to let so-and-so pass. This was a technique I had taken over from Section 6, which sent its agents across that way. I had adopted that technique.
As a loyal SS man, shouldn't you have reported him?
Yes, I should have. I shouldn't have let my own cousin leave the country, and I shouldn't have let the Jews emigrate to Hungary unmolested. It struck me, pardon me if I give my private opinion, it struck me as too persnickety to report these little things that I did on the side. In Vienna, for instance, I let out a Jewish couple as a favor to my uncle, who reminded me that he had helped me get a job with the vacuum oil company, where I'd always been well treated, even though Popper, the president, was a Jew, and so was Weiss, the vice president, and possibly Kannhauser, the Linz manager, and certainly Blum, the Salzburg manager.
Do you remember the name of this Jewish couple?
I don't know. No, I don't know.
You say that you submitted a detailed report to your superiors after your trip to Palestine.
I can't remember today what I wrote because not being able to visit Israel, I mean what was then Palestine, stripped the whole mission of its interest. And it's possible that the report was written not by me but by Hagen, my superior. Yes, it comes back to me now. It wasn't me, it was Hagen that wrote it.
If Hagen wrote it.
I must have signed it too, yes.
You also said that your sympathies went more to the Jews than to the Arabs. Is that true?
That is true. And in Haifa I didn't pick an Arab cab driver. I picked a Jewish cab driver to take me up Mount Carmel.
In June 1939, Dr. Lovenhertz came to you again to complain about Jews being evicted from their homes. Absolutely impossible quarters were assigned to them, and Jews were being beaten up if they ventured into the few parks that were set aside for them. Dr. Lowenhertz pleaded with you to do something about this.
Lodgings, of course, were not in my department. Neither were beatings in parks. But you see that he came to me with all his problems.
Once more, Dr. Lowenhertz called your attention to the atmosphere of panic among the Jews, caused by arrests and evictions. The community was paralyzed because it was impossible to obtain the necessary papers and permits in so short a time. The most desperate of the Jews, those who were Polish subjects or stateless, tried to leave German territory illegally to escape to Poland or Belgium. Both countries sent them back, and their return trip from the border caused the welfare agency of the Vienna community unnecessary expense.
About that, I have only this to say. It was none of my doing that they were deported or arrested. That wasn't in my department at the time. I might also state that the Central Office for Jewish Emigration was a first in the German administrative machine. This brought us numerous visitors from various departments in the so-called Old Reich who came to Vienna for this express purpose. Heydrich, who was then head of the security police, came too. The so-called Reich Kristallnacht, I don't know what else to call it, occurred during the period when this central office was active.
Do you remember exactly when?
I regret to say I do not. It must, I believe, have been in the autumn. It must have been in 1938. The incidents of that night were not the work of the police or the SD. I still remember that I went to the community the next day to form an idea of the damage, because this, too, had a very bad effect on emigration. I can still see a certain Oberführer or Brigadeführer of the General SS picking up a typewriter, and before I could even ask him whether or not he was supposed to be performing police functions, the typewriter came crashing to the floor. Senseless destruction. I told him I was the head of the central office. At that, he called me He used an obscene word. I told him government orders were not to obstruct emigration in any way, and that I would report him to my superior officer, the head of the security police and the SD. Then he threw me out. I made the report. What came of it, I don't know. After that night, we had more work on our hands than ever. By the time of my transfer to Prague, the number of Jews who had emigrated from Austria had risen to 150,000. Altogether, I believe I can remember, the figure came to 224,000 or 234,000. In the spring of 1939, the so-called Protectorate of Bohemia-Moravia was established. Dr. Staliker, who had been promoted to SS Oberfuhrer in the meantime, was sent from Vienna in his capacity as inspector of the security police and the SD to take command of the Prague security police and SD. I was sure that once Dr. Staliker took up his new post, he would put through my transfer to Prague as soon as possible. Around April 1939, I was ordered to Prague. At first, I was reluctant to leave Vienna. When you've set up that kind of office, you don't like to give it up. I had no difficulty with the Jewish functionaries, and I don't think any of them would have complained about me. Not even today. I certainly don't believe so, because they knew I wasn't a Jew hater. I've never been an anti-Semite, and I've never made a secret of the fact. I'm not trying to praise myself. I just want to say that our collaboration at the central office was decently businesslike. As a child in elementary school, I had a Jewish friend, and the last time we met, we went for a walk together on the Landstrasse in Linz. I already had the party badge in my buttonhole, and he thought nothing of it. Meanwhile, Hauptsturmführer Rolf Günther and the future Hauptsturmführer Alois Brunner took over the central office in Vienna. I wasn't in charge there anymore, only in Prague. The Prague central office was much smaller than the one in Vienna, but the system was exactly the same. The functionaries of the Prague Jewish organizations went to Vienna, and the functionaries of the Vienna Jewish organizations came to Prague. That way, I had no need to take a hand. Prague simply followed the example of Vienna. That alone made for a smooth start, though I must also say that there was no one in Prague with Dr. Löwenhertz's energy, far from it. The people in Prague were calmer and more easygoing, and for that reason neither side registered the same success as in Vienna. But it is also possible that it was too late for our foreign missions to accomplish much, because in many places, most of the cream had been skimmed off by our agents working out of Vienna. In that respect, the gentlemen in Prague had a harder time of it. In Prague, too, an emigration fund was set up.
Who were your Jewish associates there?
I got along best with Dr. Mermelstein, the rabbi. There was also a doctor, Weinmann, and a Herr Epstein. I think his name was Epstein. Maybe it was their Czech accent that kept us from, how shall I say, making contact. Just with Dr. Mermelstein, it didn't take long. Later on, it was he, Dr. Weinmann, and some other functionaries of the Jewish organizations they themselves chose who set up Theresienstadt. With Dr. Staliker, I had a good personal relationship that went beyond our duty hours. We met privately on Sunday mornings, and naturally we spoke, among many other things, about the possibility of a solution, a political solution, because that was the beginning and end of my whole career in the SD. Theresienstadt, where, as the Protectorate government had decided, the Jews of Bohemia and Moravia were to be concentrated, was much too small for the purpose. Give the Jews an autonomous territory, then the whole problem will be solved to the satisfaction of all. As long as the British are in Palestine and immigration is strictly limited, another territory must be made available. The Polish campaign was succeeding beyond all expectation. I don't remember whether the idea came from Staliker or from me. Anyway, someone had it. The idea was that as soon as possible, we, that is the SD, should set aside as large a territory as possible as a protectorate.
Was that so urgent in the middle of the war?
The war had reduced the possibilities of emigration. On the other hand, the Gauleiters, the propaganda ministry, in other words Goebbels, and the office of the Führer's deputy, in other words Bormann, were putting every possible pressure on us. They did not communicate directly with men of my rank. They addressed themselves to the chief, Himmler. He was the kind of man who always wanted to oblige the highly placed, then highly placed leaders. It was considered the right thing to meddle in Jewish affairs. No sooner had Hitler made a speech, and he invariably touched on the Jewish question, than every party or government department felt that it was up to them to do something. And then Himmler authorized each one to attend to it. He'd pass the order on to Heydrich, head of the security police, and the SD, who would pass it on to Müller, and then it came to me.
Who was Müller?
He was my immediate superior, promoted to Gruppenführer a little later. I'll come back to Müller's Reich Security Headquarters. May I now continue where I left off, namely, with Poland? Yes, there we were beginning to see daylight. One day, my chief, Dr. Stahlecker, whom I've already mentioned, and I took a trip to Poland. We went as far as the San in southeastern Poland, a tributary of the Vistula. When we got to the demarcation line, some Russian police guards led us a short way through Russian territory. We finally came to Nisko on the San. Nisko was in the Radom government. This I only knew from Jewish sources, because I had sent out some Jews to investigate settlement possibilities in that district. We went in, we saw an enormous territory, river, villages, markets, small towns, and we said to ourselves, this is perfect. Why not resettle the Poles, seeing there's so much resettling being done in any case, and then move Jews into this big territory? The Eastern Jews are remarkably skillful craftsmen. If industries are set up, if Jews are brought in from Austria, Germany, Czechoslovakia, Bohemia, and Moravia, protectorate plus agriculture, that might easily provide a temporary solution, sure to be good for quite a while. That would relieve the worst of the pressure. It would benefit all concerned. It would be a political success for the Reich government. And it would take care of one point in the party program, solution of the Jewish problem. We, the security police, would have nothing more to worry about. One thing at least would be settled. So Stahlecker submitted the proposition to Heydrich. It was approved, and I received an order to send 500 or maybe 1,000, I can't be sure of the numbers at this late date, Jewish artisans with a few trainloads of material to Nisko to put up a village of shacks and using it as a center to settle Jews in proportion as the inhabitants were moved out.
On October 10, 1939, Dr. Löwenherz in Vienna was ordered to organize the first shipment of Jews to Poland. The community was to select 1,000 to 1,200 able-bodied men, mostly artisans, especially carpenters and mechanics. They were to take woodworking equipment with them, saws, axes, hammers, nails.
Right, that was for Nisko.
And food for 3 or 4 weeks. The report goes on to say that Dr. Löwenherz requested authorization to see SS Hauptsturmführer Eichmann and state his misgivings.
Right.
About this shipment of Jews to Poland.
Right.
On October 27th, Dr. Löwenherz saw Hauptsturmführer Eichmann. Of course, he said, the community realized that it had to carry out the missions assigned to it.
Right.
But met with difficulties among the Jewish population.
Just as preparations were in full swing, the post of Governor General was created in the person of Frank. We called him the Polish Frank to distinguish him from K.H. Frank, the state secretary in Prague. That was the beginning of heavy-handed obstructionism. A big tug of war set in. Frank raised a big hullabaloo in Berlin. He wanted to solve his own Jewish question, and he didn't want any Jews sent to his government general. The ones who were there had to clear out immediately. Frank ordered SS Brigadeführer Streckenbach, commander of the security police in the SD in Krakow, to arrest me the moment I set foot in the government general. Streckenbach told me about it. He had no right to arrest me without the authorization of his superior and mine, Heydrich. In his anger, Frank had probably overlooked this fact. Well, that put an end to our dream of a temporary solution. At the beginning of October 1939, I believe it was, Hauptsturmführer Günther, my permanent representative at the Vienna Central Office, and I were ordered by telegraph to report to the future SS Gruppenführer Müller, head of the secret state police in Berlin. Supposedly, I was to brief Goering on the Jewish question. In reality, Günther and I were transferred to Berlin to set up a central office for Jewish emigration. I pointed out that I was indispensable in Prague and tried to get out of it on various pretexts. For instance, I had just been transferred from Vienna to Prague. They didn't say yes, and they didn't say no, and I was beginning to think I had won out. But a few days later, I received a telegram informing me, this time explicitly, that I was to be transferred as of such and such a date. After delegating my duties in the Protectorate, I went to Berlin with Hauptsturmführer Günther. The headquarters assigned to us were in Kurfürstenstrasse, number 116, I think it was, a building that had formerly belonged to some Jewish institution. There had also been a restaurant in it. The place was a complex of marble stairways and enormous rooms. It would be hard to imagine anything more unsuitable for administrative quarters, but we managed to set up a business office. Little by little, we brought in the people we needed from Prague and Vienna to set up a conveyor belt of the kind already functioning in Prague and Vienna. A Dr. Epstein of the Reich Association of Jews in Germany, Reichsvereinigung der Juden in Deutschland, that, I believe, was the name of the official umbrella organization, had roughly the same function in Berlin as Dr. Löwenherz in Vienna. The government departments concerned sent their delegates, and the work got started. Of course, it was late in the day. I'm referring to the shutdown of emigration that would become definitive with the onset of war against the Soviet Union. Already, emigration had become exceedingly difficult, and as far as I know, the only avenue that remained open was to the south, and also to the east via Romania. At the central office, in short, we were hanging on by the skin of our teeth. The mood, I might say, was one of discouragement on both sides. With the Jews, because it was really hard to find any possibilities of emigration worth mentioning. On our side, because nothing was going on and we weren't getting any callers at our office.
But wasn't it one of your duties to clear Vienna at least of Jews by the end of 1940?
Not only Vienna, Herr Hauptmann. I had been given all sorts of deadlines, and I had to proceed accordingly. At this point, I can't help saying that it has always been easy to give orders. But these deadlines were never met, because the implementation of our program depended on many factors, which went far beyond my sphere of action.
Now let me read from a report of the Vienna Central Office. On December 2nd, 1939, Dr. Löwenherz reported to Hauptsturmführer Eichmann, he must have gone to see you in Berlin, that the American Joint Distribution Committee had informed him that foreign exchange would. Now let me read from a report of the Vienna Central Office. On December 2nd, 1939, Dr. Löwenherz reported to Hauptsturmführer Eichmann, he must have gone to see you in Berlin, that the American Joint Distribution Committee had informed him that foreign exchange would be supplied only on the basis of continued emigration. If from March 1940 on, shipments of Jews to Poland were resumed, the payments would stop. Hauptsturmführer Eichmann authorized Dr. Löwenherz to inform the Joint that the shipments to Poland would be stopped if the Joint declared its readiness to supply the community with foreign exchange until the end of 1940, and if the community committed itself to inducing a corresponding number of Jews to emigrate, so that the emigration program might be liquidated by the end of October 1940.
I communicated these conditions to Dr. Löwenherz in Berlin. From then on, I did nothing in the secret state police office there without clearing it with the head of Section 4. I no longer had to consult the inspector in Vienna or the commanding officer in Prague. I must certainly at that time have approached Heydrich, not orally but in writing, through the head of Section 4. I said, "We will get so and so much foreign exchange if the shipments of Jews to Poland are stopped." The answer seems to have been, no more shipments. At about that time, there was a big shake-up at the secret state police, and I was put in charge of Bureau 4B4. Evidently, Müller said to himself, "They have nothing to do in their emigration office. I can cut down on personnel." That was the Jewish office, which up until then had been located at 8 Prince Albrecht Strasse, along with Section 4. Himmler and Heydrich under him were my top superiors. Section 4 at Security Police Headquarters was headed by Gruppenführer Müller. Between him and my department, there was yet another Gruppenleiter for Group B. Naturally, all papers had to go through him to be countersigned, but he was not exactly burdened with knowledge of what we were doing, so I always tried to go directly to Müller. Altogether, Section 4 had roughly from 18 to 22 bureaus. For lack of space, the bureau assigned to me stayed on Kurfürstenstrasse. In addition to Günther, I had a few men from Vienna and Prague at the Central Office for Jewish Emigration. In taking over Bureau 4B4 from the Secret State Police, I acquired the entire staff, except for the director.
When you speak of Günther, which Günther do you mean? There were two brothers.
Hauptsturmführer Günther, Rolf Günther. He was my permanent representative, Ständiger Vertreter. We didn't use the word deputy, Stellvertreter. So the routine work of the bureau went on as before, because the personnel had only changed their place of work. Günther attended mostly to this new Gestapo work, which we were both completely unfamiliar with, though he really didn't have to, because the original staff, if I may use a vulgar expression, worked their balls off anyway. That was their idea of duty. I myself concentrated on the Madagascar plan.
How did you hit on that?
Emigration had dropped to practically nothing as a result of the war. If you don't mind my going back again, Theresienstadt had not been a solution, and the NISCO on the SAN experiment had failed too. Then the French campaign got underway, and that gave me new hope of at least a temporary solution. I remembered Theodor Herzl's efforts to bring about a Jewish state, described by Adolf Böhm, and that at one time Herzl had considered plans for Madagascar. I also remembered that, in this connection, he had met with considerable opposition in his own ranks. I said to myself, It's all the same to me how we get soil and living space. The main thing is to do something. The situation was getting more and more acute as the Jews were driven out of one part of the country after another, on the one hand by legal restrictions, and on the other by party pressure on the non-Jewish population to boycott the Jews. It was plain as day. You didn't have to be a genius to see that if things went on that way, the result would be turmoil, the nature of which I didn't really foresee at the time. I certainly suspected nothing like what happened later on. But something had to be done, I said to myself, because a boiler full of water with a fire under it and no safety valve is bound to explode. I, in my little job, wanted to help look for that valve, and it seemed to me that my efforts to find ways and means of resettlement were just such a safety valve. The Madagascar plan struck me as a new hope for a solution. By then, I had learned from Theresienstadt that ghettoization accomplished nothing. The way I planned it, it would have offered a relatively satisfactory partial solution for about 10,000 people, but too many people were shipped in. Many of the Gauleiters wanted to rid their territories of all Jews too old to emigrate. They kept after Himmler to ship their Jews, as they called them, to Theresienstadt. On the other hand, the Gauleiter of Saxony opposed this ghetto on the grounds that Jews so close to the borders of his Gau territory were a hotbed of infection and a center of black marketing. I continually referred to these difficulties in my reports, though they were not in my jurisdiction because the ghettoization program was under Himmler's personal command. For a long time, Himmler was under the influence of Streicher-Stürmer ideas, in sharp contradistinction to Heydrich, his security police and SD chief, who had no use for this unrealistic fool's wisdom, as I called it on one occasion.
You thought Madagascar more realistic?
I first went to the Reich Office for Emigration at the Ministry of the Interior and made inquiries about the geographical, climatic, geological, and other conditions. I obtained detailed information from the Tropical Institute in Hamburg, and the picture did not seem too unfavorable. From the juridical point of view, I had in mind an autonomous Jewish region of Madagascar. Up until then, I had always functioned as a kind of specialized assistant, hiding behind the broad back of a superior. In Berlin, that changed. Now I was in charge, and I was brought into contact with an administrative machine such as I had never encountered before or even heard of. You can't imagine the difficulties I ran into, the tedious, tooth and nail negotiations, the thousands of objections raised by the various agencies. They all felt it was their business. For instance, the Foreign Office claimed that the security police should have no say in the matter because Madagascar wasn't Germany. None of these people understood our aims or intentions. They had never read, studied, assimilated any basic work on the subject. They had no contact, no inner contact, with the question. They didn't throw themselves into the problem as such. A Regierungsrat Lischke, for instance, would never have concerned himself with such a matter. A Regierungsrat Lischke, a Regierungsrat Lange, a Regierungsrat Zur, a Regierungsrat XYZ. Not one of them, I tell you. No dry-as-dust office manager would have bothered about Nisko on the San or Theresienstadt. He wouldn't have bothered with any of that because he wasn't interested. Because it's not in the files, not in the registers, so he won't touch it. Such people, of course, lead a quieter life. They make things a good deal easier for themselves. These people had never read, studied, assimilated, let's say, a basic work. They had no contact, no inner contact with this thing. By the time the plan seemed fully clarified and none of the departments had any more changes to suggest, it was too late. The German army had long been in Paris, but by then, nothing could be done about Madagascar. When the French fleet put out to sea and Germany occupied the previously unoccupied zone of France as far as the Mediterranean seaboard, Madagascar was out of the question. It was all over. The plan had been wrecked. I capitulated. The dream was over. That must have been in 1940.
But the plan was supposed to contribute to a solution of the Jewish question.
To a considerable degree, mainly at first with regard to the Jews located in Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia. What would have been possible after that remained to be seen.
How about the Jews in the government general? Were they taken into account?
Undoubtedly. I had started that in Radom.
Have you ever heard of a report by a Polish commission of inquiry that visited Madagascar in 1937?
No, never. I got the idea from Theodor Herzl.
Are you aware that Madagascar had previously been investigated by this Polish commission, for instance?
No, I'm not. No, I didn't know.
Which came to the conclusion that a maximum of 15,000 European families could be settled there, while certain members of the commission thought that figure far too high.
No, Herr Hauptmann. No, I never heard about that. I relied on what the Ministry of the Interior told me, the Reich Office for Immigration and Emigration. I believe it was during my Madagascar efforts that an evacuation action from the Baden area was undertaken. This was the situation. Himmler informed the head of the security police and the SD that Gauleiter so-and-so, I forget his name, had petitioned him to get rid of his Jews. It seems that Himmler consented and gave orders that these Jews should be shipped to unoccupied French territory. My organization, Bureau B4, had to requisition the trains from the Reich Transportation Ministry. A so-called scheduling conference was held at the ministry, and an itinerary via Chalon-sur-Marne was decided on. Here I have the following to say. During the war, one of the first measures taken by the Transportation Ministry was to rationalize the utilization of rolling stock. An agreement was reached with Heydrich. The ministry said, all requisitions of rolling stock for security police missions must be channeled through one bureau. Then, if we get an order, we'll know it's necessary. Then we'll know the order is war important. Later that term was replaced by war crucial. That applied to all departments, and in our department it was decided that Bureau 4B4 should handle these requisitions. It made no difference whether it was Poland or gypsies, building materials or prefabs, everything went through my bureau. Myler or Heydrich might just as well have chosen some other bureau, clothing supply for instance. Chalon-sur-Marne, I believe, was the last station in occupied France. Then came the unoccupied zone. It was dinned into me that these trains must not stop anywhere in the occupied zone. But at the border station, I couldn't help seeing that it would be absolutely impossible to move a convoy of 4 to 6 trains, passenger trains they were, across the demarcation line. In the first place, it was guarded by police, and in the unoccupied zone, the French were autonomous. In the second place, the tracks were blocked by signals. How I got the idea of telling the station master at the last station in the occupied zone that these were Wehrmacht troop trains, and why the station master believed me and sent the trains through after he had seen them, I couldn't tell you today. I only know that it would have turned out very badly for the Jews and for me too if the trains had been stopped at that point. They couldn't have gone ahead, and they couldn't have gone back. When the last train had passed, I got into my car, I was bathed in sweat, and drove off as fast as I could. After that, there were difficulties with the French government in Vichy, but the Foreign Office had to straighten them out.
How many Jews were evacuated in this way?
There were 4 to 6 trains, roughly 3,500 to 4,000 Jews, I should say. These shipments to France are a typical example of Himmler's impulsive reactions and how, out of the blue, he would issue orders that led to impossible situations. Himmler was greatly feared for this reason. Just one little example. If Himmler sent for an officer who was a smoker, pumice stone and lemon would be put into the toilet of his special train or command post. Because if Himmler saw nicotine stains on the man's fingernails, he was perfectly capable of taking his hand and saying, "No smoking for 3 months, 6 months." Your word as an officer. That's an order. Dismissed. Seeing I had nothing interesting to do after the Madagascar plan fell through, I asked Gruppenführer Müller to transfer me to some city as police president. His answer, "A soldier can't decide where he chooses to fight." Later on, I tried several times to be sent to the front, always with the same negative result. Toward the end of 1940, the ghettoization measures in the government general went into an intensive, or you might say final, phase, and also in Warthego, from the Warta River in southwestern Poland, an action which did not concern Bureau 4B4. At this time, Gruppenführer Müller, my immediate superior, sent me on frequent trips to Poland with instructions to inspect one thing or another and report to him. He himself never left Berlin, but he insisted on being thoroughly informed. So I inspected the ghetto of Litzmannstadt, now it's called Łódź again, and the Warsaw ghetto too.
You might tell me what the functions of your department were at this time.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Bureau 4B4 had undergone a number of slight changes. When I took it over, it was simply called Jewish Affairs. I can't say for sure whether over the years, before it acquired the official title Weltanschauliche Gegnerbekämpfung, Defense Against Ideological Enemies, it ever bore the title Final Solution of the Jewish Question. Originally, the words final solution had nothing to do with physical extermination, of which I shall have more to say. I already had the words final solution of the Jewish question in mind when I took up the Madagascar project.
Was it already called Final Solution of the Jewish Question at that time?
Herr Hauptmann, I am certain that the term final solution was usual even before that. It was one of the terms employed by Heydrich and Himmler. When I took over the bureau, it handled withdrawal of nationality and citizenship and the confiscation of property. That was a complicated business. The state police never saw the property, only the orders.
Were the orders countersigned by you before being sent on?
Often they were initialed at the bottom by the post office. These were routine papers. The whole process was automatic, printed forms. You didn't have to read them.
Now tell me about the deportation of Jews from Western and Eastern Europe.
As far as I can remember, Jews were deported from Holland, Belgium, France, from Greece, Slovakia, and Romania. Whether any were deported from, what's the name of that country up there? Denmark, I believe, from Hungary. I don't know if I've forgotten some country.
Italy?
Italy proper, no, but possibly from places in the Côte d'Azur region that were somehow connected with border disputes. Les offers Eichmann a cigarette. Thank you. Gracias. Of course, I haven't the faintest idea how many were evacuated from these countries, how many shipments were sent out. I'd have to make up figures, but that wouldn't do anyone any good. I'll do it, of course, if you wish. Yours to command.
Very well. We'll come back to that. You have touched on the final solution of the Jewish question. Would you like to speak about that now, or about the war with Russia first?
The final solution depends. It's mixed up with something that happened after the start of the German-Russian War. At that time, Reich Marshal Goering issued a document conferring a special title on the head of the security police and the SD. I'm trying to remember the wording. Was it deputy charged with the final solution, or was it with the solution of the Jewish question?
Wouldn't this document relate to the period prior to the outbreak of the Second World War?
We can only be sure that it relates to the period when emigration had ceased to be possible and the more radical solution was resorted to. The war with the Soviet Union began in June 1941, I think. And I believe it was 2 months later, or maybe 3, that Heydrich sent for me. I reported. He said to me, "The Führer, well, emigration is..." He began with a little speech, and then, "The Führer has ordered physical extermination." These were his words, and as though wanting to test their effect on me, he made a long pause, which was not at all his way. I can still remember that. In the first moment, I didn't grasp the implications, because he chose his words so carefully. But then I understood. I didn't say anything. What could I say? Because I'd never thought of such a thing, of that sort of violent solution. And then he said to me, "Eichmann, go and see Globoknik in Lublin."
Who?
Globoknik, the former Gauleiter of Vienna, was then head of the SS and the police in the Lublin district of the government general. Anyway, Heydrich said, "Go and see Globoknik. The Führer has already given him instructions. Take a look and see how he's getting on with his program. I believe he's using Russian anti-tank trenches for exterminating the Jews." As ordered, I went to Lublin, located the headquarters of SS and police commander Globoknik, and reported to the Gruppenführer. I told him Heydrich had sent me, because the Führer had ordered the physical extermination of the Jews.
The Gruppenführer.
I beg your pardon?
The Gruppenführer?
The Führer. The Führer was Hitler. Yes, the Führer was meant. I've only quoted Heydrich's words. He said, "The Führer has ordered that is, Hitler has ordered the physical extermination of the Jews." Globoknik sent for a certain Sturmbannführer, Höfler, who must have been a member of his staff. We went from Lublin to, I don't remember what the place was called, I get them mixed up. I couldn't say if it was Treblinka or some other place. There were patches of woods, sort of, and the road passed through, a Polish highway. On the right side of the road, there was an ordinary house. That's where the men who worked there lived. A captain of the regular police, Ordnungspolizei, welcomed us. A few workmen were still there. The captain, which surprised me, had taken off his jacket and rolled up his sleeves. Somehow he seemed to have joined in the work. They were building little wooden shacks, 2, maybe 3 of them. They looked like 2 or 3 room cottages. Höfler told the police captain to explain the installation to me. And then he started in. He had let's say a vulgar, uncultivated voice. Maybe he drank. He spoke some dialect from the southwestern corner of Germany, and he told me how he had made everything airtight. It seems they were going to hook up a Russian submarine engine and pipe the exhaust into the houses, and the Jews inside would be poisoned. I was horrified. My nerves aren't strong enough. I can't listen to such things, without their affecting me. Even today, if I see someone with a deep cut, I have to look away. I could never have been a doctor. I still remember how I visualized the scene and began to tremble, as if I'd been through something, some terrible experience, the kind of thing that happens sometimes and afterwards you start to shake. Then I went to Berlin and reported to the head of the security police.
Müller?
Yes, Müller, of course.
Not Heydrich?
Yes, Heydrich. But Müller was my immediate superior. I told him what I've told you now. Maybe I'm getting some things mixed up. Do you mind if I put down takes paper and pencil.
Go right ahead.
Dates, a few notes, because I'm trying to keep things straight. That was, yes, as I said before, it must have been late summer, autumn.
What year?
After the war broke out between Germany and Russia. That would make it the autumn of 1941. Then I was sent on to Kulm, Chelmno, in Vartegau. I received orders from Miller to go to Litzmannstadt and report back to him on what was going on there. He didn't put it the same way as Heydrich, not as crassly. An action against the Jews is underway there, Eichmann. Go take a look, and then report to me. I went to Gestapo headquarters in Litzmannstadt. Now it's Lodz again, and there I was told. It was a special team, put in by the Reichsführer, Himmler, and they told me exactly where this Kulm is situated. I saw the following. A room, perhaps, if I remember right, about 5 times as big as this one here. There were Jews in it. They had to undress, and then a sealed truck drove up. The doors were opened. It drove up to a kind of ramp. The naked Jews had to get in. Then the doors were closed, and the truck drove off.
How many people did this truck hold?
I don't know exactly. The whole time it was there, I didn't look inside. I couldn't. What I saw and heard was enough. The screaming, and I was much too shaken, and so on. I told Miller that in my report. He didn't get much out of it. I drove after the truck, and there I saw the most horrible sight I'd seen in all my life. It drove up to a fairly long trench. The doors were opened and corpses were thrown out. The limbs were as supple as if they'd been alive, just thrown in. I can still see a civilian with pliers pulling out teeth, and then I beat it. I got into my car and drove off. I didn't say another word. I sat there for hours without saying a word to my driver. I'd had enough. I was through. The only other thing I remember is that a doctor in a white smock wanted me to look through a peephole and watch the people inside the truck. I refused. I couldn't say another word. I had to get out of there. In Berlin, I reported to Gruppenführer Müller. I told him the same as I've told you now. Terrible, an inferno. I can't do it, I told him.
What did Müller say?
Müller never said anything. Never. Not about these things, and not about other things. He was always very terse and unemotional. He only said what was strictly necessary. He'd say yes, or he'd say no. And when he didn't say yes or no, he usually said, "Eichmann, my friend." That wasn't yes, and it wasn't no. He was a man of few words.
Did you report on this in writing?
No, I couldn't do that. I was expressly forbidden to, by Heydrich, I believe. Müller wanted especially to know how long it takes. I wasn't able to tell him that. I couldn't hear. I should have gone out there a second time. But naturally, I didn't volunteer, and nothing was said to me.
Did you also see Jews being gassed with a submarine engine by Globoknik's outfit?
No, I did not see that, but I'll come back to it. I was sent there another time. Let me think a moment, Herr Hauptmann. I was sent there after the following places. The 2 I've mentioned, and then Auschwitz, Oswiecim. And then I was sent to Treblinka. And then to... What's the name of that double battle near Minsk? Near Minsk. Anyway, to Minsk, Auschwitz, Treblinka, Minsk. That's all, I believe. Oh, yes. And Lemberg, Lvov, Lemberg. That's it. Those are the 6 places.
Were these just information-gathering missions? Or did you have some special assignment?
No assignment? No assignment. I had no orders to give or anything else. No instructions about who to gas, or whether anyone was to be gassed, whether the gassing could or should be stopped, or started or intensified. I never had anything to do with all that, Herr Hauptmann. If the newspapers said I did, it's a lie. I'm telling you the whole truth.
What was the function of your bureau within the framework of the extermination program?
Evacuation, but not in the government general of Poland. And later on, I hope to speak of the occupied Russian territories, where the situation was different.
Herr Eichmann, you wish to speak of your visits to the extermination camps?
Yes, that's right. Müller said to me, "In Minsk, the Jews are being shot. I'd like a report on that." So I went to Minsk. I had nothing at all to do there. I didn't know anybody. I went to the command post. What was it called again? Commander Security Police. Or could it have been Action Team Security Police? And asked for the commanding officer. I still remember, he wasn't there. I spoke to someone else and told him I had orders to see what was going on. I spent the night in that town, and next day I went to the place, but I got there too late. The work for that morning was already done, almost done, and I was very glad of that. When I got there, I was just in time to see some young riflemen. I believe they were riflemen, with the death's head collar patch, shooting into a pit, maybe 4 or 5 times as big as this room, maybe bigger, say 6 or 7 times. My orientation in this case is unreliable, because I saw this thing without thinking. I didn't think anything at all. I just saw it, and that's all. They fired into the pit, I can still see a woman with her arms behind her back, and then her knees crumpled, and I cleared out.
The pit was full of corpses?
It was full. It was full. I went to my car, I got in and drove away. I drove to Lemberg. I had no orders to go to Lemberg, I remember now. Somehow I went to Lemberg and found the man in charge of the Gestapo command post, and I said to him, "It's horrible what they're doing there. They're training young men to be sadists." I told Müller the exact same thing. I told Gunther too. I told everybody. I told them all. And I said to that SS officer in Lemberg, "How can they stand there firing at a woman and children? How is it possible? It's just not. Those men will either go mad or they'll turn into sadists. Our own men." He said to me, "They're doing the same thing right here, shooting. Want to see?" "No," I said. "I don't want to see anything. We're driving past there anyway," he said. There had been a pit there. It was already filled in, and blood was gushing out of it. How shall I say? Like a geyser. I've never seen anything like it. I'd had enough of that mission. I went back to Berlin and reported what I'd seen to Gruppenführer Müller. I said to him, "This is no solution to the Jewish question. And besides, we're training our men to be sadists. We shouldn't be surprised if they all turn out to be criminals, all criminals." I still remember Müller looking at me with an expression that said, "Eichmann, you're right. That's no solution." But there was nothing he could do about it. Müller definitely couldn't do a thing. Not a thing. Not a thing. Who gave the orders for those actions? The orders. Obviously, the orders were given by the head of the security police and the SD, namely Heydrich, but he must also have had his instructions from the Reichsführer SS, namely Himmler. On his own hook, he could never have done such things on his own hook. And Himmler must have had express orders from Hitler. If he hadn't had orders from Hitler, he'd have been out on his ear before he knew what hit him.
Didn't Himmler give written orders about this final solution of the Jewish question?
Writ for extermination, physical extermination.
For physical extermination.
I never saw a written order, Herr Hauptmann. All I know is that Heydrich said to me, "The Führer has ordered the physical extermination of the Jews." He said that as clearly and surely as I'm repeating it now. And those were the first results, small-scale results, that I'm telling you about now. I implored the Gruppenführer, "Please, don't send me there. Send someone else, someone with stronger nerves." They never let me go to the front. I was never a soldier. There are plenty of other men who can bear to see such things, who won't keel over. I can't stand it. I can't sleep at night. I have nightmares. I can't stand it, Gruppenführer. But it didn't get me anywhere.
Were Jews from the Reich, from Austria and the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia sent to Riga and Minsk in the autumn of 1941?
In 1941, Herr Hauptmann, that is possible. I don't know. I only know that there were trains going to Minsk and Riga.
Did you know that in the autumn of that year, action groups, Einsatzgruppen, liquidated Jews by shooting, both in Riga and in Minsk?
I didn't know about it at the time, but of course I heard about it later.
You say you inspected Minsk?
I have already said that 4B4, my bureau, had nothing to do with the activity of the action groups in the East. We neither directed them nor gave them orders. Nor did we send any observers or advisors.
Did you receive periodic reports about the action groups, so-called occurrence reports, hence communications about the liquidation of the Jews in Russia?
Yes, about the liquidation of the Jews along with other activities of the action groups. I never claimed not to know about this liquidation. I only said that Bureau 4B4 had nothing to do with it. Here I must add something that, chronologically speaking, should have been mentioned before: the conference about the Barbarossa project. Shortly before the start of the German-Russian War, a conference was held in Berlin, which all the top men at Reich Security headquarters were obliged to attend. There, for the first time, I heard the code name for the war preparations against the Soviet Union. Someone read an organizational paper, prepared long before, and it mentioned the action groups and action teams in the East. As the German troops advanced, action groups under the commander of the security police and the SD, Heydrich, moved up right behind them and took over police power. The leader of one of these action groups was Ohlendorf, who testified at the war crimes trials in Nuremberg that his group shot 84,000, or maybe it was 94,000 Jews.
Was it stated at this conference what the mission and function of these action groups was to be?
No, it was not stated. I thought it was something military, something to do with the offensive, with the Waffen-SS, and I was upset about it at the time because I thought I'd been passed over. My advancement had been relatively rapid, and I said to myself, now I'm an Obersturmbannführer, but if they send me to the front, I'll be promoted to Standartenführer in no time. As it happened, I stayed an Obersturmbannführer, until May 8th, 1945. I couldn't be promoted anymore. A bureau head, referent, was equivalent to Regierungsrat or Oberregierungsrat in the government service, and I had already made the corresponding SS rank.
You were also in Auschwitz?
I kept getting orders to visit Auschwitz. Müller told me they were expanding the plant, and he wanted me to take a look and report back to him. Herr Hauptmann, those fellows were very cruel, describing those things as gruesomely as possible to a man accustomed to desk work, putting it to him as abruptly as possible. Naturally, they laughed their heads off when my nerves broke down, and I couldn't keep up my military dignity, that's what they called it, the way they did. Huss told me Himmler had been there and taken a good look at everything. He told me the Reichsfuhrer himself had gone all weak in the knees. He meant that, in a disparaging sense, because Huss himself was thoroughly hardened. That was the day when Himmler, after seeing that, undoubtedly to screw up his own courage and hide his weakness from his concentration camp men, told Huss that those were battles the coming generation wouldn't have to fight. When I visited the installation, Huss sent for an all-terrain car. We drove to a certain place. I don't know my way around Auschwitz. I never got any further than the command post at the main entrance. Had no desire to. As we were driving, I saw some big buildings, almost like factories, enormous chimneys. Huss says to me, "Working to capacity, 10,000. A job was underway. They were separating the able-bodied from the ones who were supposedly unfit for work. I didn't watch the gassing. I couldn't. I'd have probably keeled over. And I thought, woo, I've got it over with again. But then he drives me to a big trench. It was very big. I can't say exactly how big, maybe 100 meters long, maybe 150 or 180. And there was an enormous grating, an iron grating, and corpses were burning on it. Then I got sick to my stomach. Sick to my stomach.
But you were in Treblinka again?
I'd like to say something about this last point of this terrible, terrible business. I mean Treblinka. I was given orders. I went to see Globoknik in Treblinka. That was the second time. The installations were now in operation, and I had to report to Müller. I expected to see a wooden house on the right side of the road, and a few more wooden houses on the left. That's what I remembered. Instead, again with the same Sturmbannführer Höfler, I come to a railroad station with a sign saying Treblinka, looking exactly like a German railroad station anywhere in Germany, a replica with signboards, etc. There I hung back as far as I could. I didn't push closer to see it all. I saw a footbridge enclosed in barbed wire, and over that footbridge a file of naked Jews was being driven into a house. A big one-room structure, to be gassed. As I was told, they were gassed with DOT. What's it called? Potassium cyan.
Cyanide.
Potassium cyanide, or cyanic acid. In acid form, it's called cyanic acid. I didn't look to see what happened. I reported to Müller, and as usual, he listened in silence, without a word of comment. Just his facial expression said, "There's nothing I can do about it. I am convinced, Herr Hauptmann. I know it sounds odd coming from me, but I'm convinced that if it had been up to Müller, it wouldn't have happened."
What do you know about Zyklon B gas?
I don't know anything except what I heard there, that it's contained in beer. I mean, I've heard today for the first time that it's called Zyklon B. Then I was told that it came in tablets that looked like beer mats, cardboard coasters. But whether it was Zyklon B or prussic acid, I have no idea.
I am now going to quote from the German edition of the proceedings of the trial of the leading war criminals before the International Military Court in Nuremberg. From the sworn testimony of Rudolf Höss, who was camp commander at Auschwitz from 1940 to 1943. He said Eichmann was repeatedly in Auschwitz and knew exactly what was being done.
Herr Hauptmann, I knew no more than what I have said. I knew the killing was done with those round cardboard things. Höss told me that. He even showed me one. Then I saw the outside of that big building. Neither in Auschwitz nor anywhere else did I observe the extermination process. It was only in Minsk that I got there while the shooting was going on. Everywhere else I refused, because the burning of the corpses was as much as I could stand. I wasn't up to it.
When Rudolf Höss was under arrest in Poland, he made autobiographical notes. Here I have his book, Commandant of Auschwitz. I'm going to read a passage. Eichmann told me about the killing by exhaust fumes in trucks, as had been practiced in the East up until then. That, however, would not have been possible for the mass shipments that were to be expected. Killing by spraying with carbon monoxide in a bathroom, as had been done with the mentally ill in some places in the Reich, would have required too many buildings. Moreover, it was questionable whether sufficient gas could be procured for such a vast number of people. We left the matter unresolved. Eichmann undertook to find out about a gas that was easily obtainable and required no special installations and report to me about it. Have you a comment to make?
Yes, sir. The overwhelming majority of these assertions are pure invention. It is obvious to me that he was interested in only one thing: clearing his own department, the SS Administration and Supply Headquarters, commanded by Obergruppenführer Pohl. Precisely in connection with the technical details, which the Gestapo had nothing to do with, he is trying to clear the technical sections of the SS Administration and Supply Headquarters, keep them out of it for reasons unknown to me. Still, to all intents and purposes, known. I never in any way, and to this I will take any oath, Herr Hauptmann, discussed this matter with Höss. On the contrary, when Müller sent me to Auschwitz for the first time, it was Höss who showed me those cardboard mats.
I will now show you a document presented by the prosecution at the first Nuremberg war crimes trial. It is a statement by Dr. Kurt Gerstein, former head of the Technical Disinfection Service in the SS Command Headquarters, Group D Hygiene, concerning the utilization of the poison gas that had been ordered from him in July 1942 by Günther, your permanent representative. Would you care to read this document through?
Yes, sir. Bends over the document and reads. It deals first with the delivery of prussic acid to Hauptsturmführer Günther on July 8, 1942, specifically of 100 kilograms of prussic acid. Next comes a report on his participation in killings in the government general. And at the end, Gerstein states that early in 1944, Günther ordered more prussic acid from him and asked whether he had a poison with which one could take advantage of the wind for killing people in Theresienstadt. I must say that all this is news to me. Of all the persons mentioned here, only one is known to me, Hauptmann Wirth. I'd forgotten the name, but quite possibly it's the same captain I told you about. All the names are unknown to me, never heard them, never pronounced them, never had anything to do with any of these people. I know nothing about Günther taking delivery of prussic acid in 1942. I must say, it's odd, very odd that Günther should be mixed up in this business, when I'm not even, I ask you, it's not that I attach any importance to it, Herr Hauptmann. Isn't it odd that I'm not even mentioned if I had anything to do with it? Anyway, I don't know anything about it. I wasn't involved in it, and if I wasn't involved, I can't very well say that I was. If I had had anything to do with it, my name would be mentioned here, as was everywhere customary.
You gave Günther the order. He certainly didn't act on his own hook.
No. That I must deny, Herr Hauptmann. I did not. Of course Günther didn't think up this thing on his own. He must have received an order. That's plain. But he didn't get the order from me. I know nothing about it. 100 kilos of prussic acid. I haven't the faintest idea. I don't know.
You recall Höss's statement about the preparations for the gassing, and you're telling him that you'd find out about a gas. If you now consider what Gerstein says here, that suddenly on June 8, 1942, Günther ordered the gas, doesn't that hang together very nicely?
Herr Hauptmann, a lot of things have happened that hang together very nicely. If I had had anything to do with it, Gerstein would certainly have mentioned me by name. Of course, some sort of order must have been given. Maybe it came direct from Müller, because by and large, Müller had come to know me for a more sensitive person than Günther. I don't mean to say that I'd shown girlish squeamishness, but I was a lot more sensitive than somebody like Günther, for instance.
For that very reason, it's hard to believe that Müller would go over your head in giving Günther a special order.
I absolutely refuse to be identified with that affair, because I had nothing to do with it. If I had had anything to do with it, all right, I'd admit it. Then I'd say to myself, after all, Himmler himself was in on it. What can I do? I received orders, and it doesn't matter. Do what you like with me. Because I couldn't help myself. I had orders. But I had nothing to do with that business.
Do you remember the Wannsee Conference? It occurs to me that you were present.
Yes, sir. I even had to write the invitations to the state secretaries. That is, Heydrich told me briefly what he wanted me to say.
Why were you invited if you played so subordinate a role?
Herr Hauptmann, I had to write the invitation. I had to supply Heydrich with the data for his speech, all the emigration figures. I was in charge of that department in the secret state police.
Müller was there too?
Yes, sir. It was a high-level conference, as they said then. Nothing below state secretaries.
Why did they bring little Eichmann in? Heydrich couldn't have wanted to keep asking you at the conference whether he was saying the right thing.
No, he did that beforehand. Things connected with emigration, because at the time of the Wannsee Conference, the killing had just begun.
Yes, officially. There had been killing before that. You claim that in 1941, around November in Auschwitz, those gassing machines were already at work.
Yes, that's right. At this conference, Heydrich made known his authorization. I'm wondering, if the killing had already started, and it had started, this probably meant a tighter organization of the program. He was appointed by Goering. Up until then, the obstacles had been too great, too many departments involved.
I regard the fact that you were brought into the Wannsee Conference as an indication that you played a more prominent role in the final solution by extermination than you admit.
9-9, Herr Hauptmann. I would admit it. I wouldn't hesitate to admit it. But I had always been bureau chief, Dezernent of Bureau 4B4, and a bureau chief in the Gestapo absolutely cannot break out of the frame in which he has been placed. If I had spoken up even once, Herr Hauptmann, I would have said yes, sir. But I had to keep my mouth shut. They kept me. I don't know, Herr Hauptmann, if you can put yourself in my place. I sat in the corner with the stenotypist, and no one bothered with us. No one. We were much too insignificant. They paid no attention to us, not even Heydrich.
That gives me the impression that they were planning a more prominent role for you in the future.
In that case, I must have given myself that role, because it was I who put myself on the list of those present. No, it's really I'd have the courage to come straight out with it. After all, what can happen to me?
I'm going to quote from your record of Heydrich's speech. Emigration has now, with the Führer's approval, been replaced by another solution, the evacuation of the Jews to the east. The present actions, however, must be viewed as mere expedients, but they offer a source of practical experience of the utmost importance with a view to the final solution to come. What does all this mean?
Since emigration was prohibited, they were to be deported to the east. This was the new, conception in behalf of which the Conference of State Secretaries was called. The new conception that Himmler discussed with Goering, undoubtedly in Heydrich's presence.
What is meant by practical experience?
The Wannsee Conference, we called it the Conference of State Secretaries, was held on January 20th, 1942. 2 months later, I was sent to see Globoknik. It is quite possible that the killing there had already begun.
I see. So you think practical experience refers to the killing of the Jews, which had already begun? It's true that action teams were already at work at the time.
They started in. Of course there was killing.
Here on page 7 of your record, Heydrich says, under appropriate leadership, the Jews should be put to work in a suitable way within the framework of the final solution. In large labor columns with separation of the sexes, the able-bodied Jews will be made to build roads as they are led into these territories. A large percentage of them will undoubtedly be eliminated by natural diminution. What is meant by natural diminution?
That's perfectly normal dying. Of a heart attack or pneumonia, for instance. If I were to drop dead just now, that would be natural diminution.
If a man is forced to perform heavy physical labor and not given enough to eat, he grows weaker. He gets so weak that he has a heart attack.
That would undoubtedly have been reported as natural diminution.
Heydrich goes on. Since the ultimate survivors will undoubtedly constitute the most resistant group, they must be treated accordingly, since this natural elite, if released, must be viewed as the potential germ cell of a new Jewish order. What does treated accordingly mean?
That comes from Himmler. Natural selection, that was his hobby.
Yes, but what does it mean here?
Killed, undoubtedly.
The record continues. State Secretary Dr. Buehler from the Office of the Governor General declared that the Government General would be glad to see steps taken toward the final solution in the Government General, because there the transportation problem was not of paramount importance and labor considerations would be no obstacle. He held that the Jews should be removed with all possible dispatch from the territory of the Government General because there more than anywhere else the Jew represents an eminent danger as a carrier of disease, and furthermore is constantly disrupting the economic structure of the country by his black market activities. Moreover, the majority of the 2.5 million Jews in question were unfit for labor. What is he suggesting?
He is suggesting that they should be killed.
Now I am going to show you a document produced by the prosecution at the 9th Nuremberg War Crimes trial. It is a special delivery letter, dated Berlin, September 21, 1939, signed Heydrich and addressed to the commanders of all the action teams. It concerns the Jewish question in Poland, which had just been occupied. Is there anything you would like to say about it?
At that time, my duties had nothing to do with those things. This order, of which I was unaware, or which at least I no longer remember after all these years, fills in a gap in my knowledge of the ghettoization process. This order lays the groundwork for ghettoization in the government general. At the very beginning it says, a distinction must be made between 1. The ultimate aim, which requires longer periods of time, and 2. The segments in the implementation of this ultimate aim, which are to be carried out on a short-term basis. After reading this now, I have this to say. To judge by this document, the order concerning the physical extermination of the Jews was not, as I formerly believed, issued or promulgated by Hitler at the outbreak of the German-Russian War. On the contrary, this, call it basic, conception was already firmly established at that date. I can think of no other interpretation for the words, the ultimate aim, which requires longer periods of time. When I came to the Gestapo, all that was underway. I still remember that, after the Wannsee Conference, Heydrich authorized Brigadeführer Globoknik, who had that killing installation in Lublin, to kill Jews, and even made the authorization retroactive.
Who conveyed this supplementary order to Globoknik?
At that time, Heydrich ordered me to draft the following letter. I authorize you to subject another 150,000 Jews to the final solution. Those Jews were already dead. Actually, I think there were 250,000. He, Globoknik, arranged to have the order given to him a second time.
Where did you keep Himmler's letter of April 1st, 1940, to the head of the security police and the SD, in which he issued the order concerning the final solution of the Jewish question?
An order from Himmler to the head of the security police. You say there was something in it about killing Jews?
About the final solution of the Jewish question which the Führer had ordered.
Herr Hauptmann, I can't imagine Himmler putting that in writing. To me, that is inconceivable.
We know from the Wannsee Conference that Heydrich also put it in writing. It's in the record of the Wannsee Conference.
Herr Hauptmann, Heydrich did not at the time of the Wannsee Conference speak of killing. He spoke of putting Jews to work in the East. That was his way of camouflaging it.
If you read through the record of the Wannsee Conference, you'll see what he meant. True, he expresses himself very euphemistically.
Well, I suppose so. If it's one of those documents that don't come out with the naked, brutal words. It's possible, Herr Hauptmann, but I can't remember that letter of Himmler's. If it ever existed, it was certainly kept in our top-secret file.
I will now read you parts of the statement made under oath by your one-time subordinate, Dieter Wisliceny, on January 3, 1946, at the Nuremberg war crimes trials. Asked what his particular duty was, Wisliceny replied, Eichmann was responsible for the so-called solution of the Jewish question in Germany and in all territories occupied by Germany. When asked about certain phases of anti-Jewish activity, Wisliceny replied, up to 1940, the Bureau's general guidelines provided for settling the Jewish question by systematic emigration. The second phase, which began at that point, provided for the concentration of all Jews in Poland and other German-occupied territories, and this in the form of ghettos. This phase lasted roughly until the beginning of 1942. The third phase was the so-called final solution, that is, the systematic extermination and destruction of the Jewish people. This phase continued until October 1944, when Himmler gave orders to stop the killing.
Wisliceny says here that ghettoization came under the Bureau's jurisdiction. That is not true. He says the killing began in 1942. That too is untrue. It should be autumn 1941.